what I want to do, come back to my watercolor. What I want to do next after I've let that dry is I'm gonna go ahead and show you a little bit about maybe how to approach that cast shadow underneath, and then also how to do something that is much more of a diffuse shadow that happens down here at the bottom. So I'll kind of switch back to my view of the objects again to show you, but let me go ahead and mix. What I'm going to do is to mix a cool kind of version of that shadow. I'm going to use my ultramarine blue. My ultramarine blue has gotten just a little bit dry on my palette, so I'm going to work that up a little bit with some water. And because I don't want it to be super blue at first, I'm going to mix a little bit of my burnt umber with it. And then I'm going to go back up to my yellow and mix a little bit of that in there too. Now, the danger of mixing yellow and blue is that I'm going to get some kind of a weird green shadow. So I don't want to put too much yellow in that. I want to keep it pretty kind of grayish looking, pretty neutral looking. And then I'm going to go back up so that I can see it. I know you guys can't see everything here. Go back up to my image. And I'm going to start with the shadow underneath the object, I think, because I can show you that while I let that dry. I can come back to the object itself, and then I'm going to jump around a little bit. So maybe there's some logic here to what I'm doing. Okay. So I've got my shadow. I'm going to work quickly. I'm going to put the shape of that shadow in there, knowing that some places in this shadow, I'm going to alter a little bit. Oh, maybe it comes out, I don't know, about this far. And then again, working quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to blot my brush on a paper towel. And with my blotted brush, I'm just going to run my brush along the edge of that shadow, just to allow the edge of that shadow to diffuse and soften a little bit. Because oftentimes with cast shadows, it's not necessarily a hard edge, but you know, it kind of fades out, right? And then again, working quickly while it's still wet, I'm going to work up a little bit of that yellow. And then because I don't want it to look super green, I'm also going to add just a little bit of my warm brown, right? That's my burnt sienna. And what I'm going to do with this section of the shadow, where I see it getting a little bit kind of yellowish, brownish, I'm going to drop that in. Right, so I'm working that wet into wet, right? Letting it bleed into that section of the shadow. And then also while it's still wet, I'm going to pick up just the ultramarine blue. And I'm going to emphasize the blueness of the shadow over here. And if I notice that there are kind of weird little edges that start to form because of my puddle here, I can go back with my brush as it's drying and kind of scoop those a little bit. I don't want to overwork it too much. And perhaps I'm gonna work up just a little more of my original mix, right? So I've got my blue, my burnt umber. And now I've got kind of just a dark neutral, right? The blue and the brown together. And if I kind of squint my eyes at that shadow, one thing I noticed is that it gets super dark right underneath the object. So I'm going to take another strip of that dark color. I'm going to drop that in right there. And then one thing I don't want to do too much of is to fuss around with it, right? I want to kind of let things dry a little bit. But if you notice that something is puddling together, you can always take a blotted brush, right? Blot it on your paper towel and pick up a little bit of what is pooling, right? So if you don't necessarily want as much of that, but don't go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth too much, right? You'll kind of overwork the paper. So that's kind of one take on how to lay in those shadows, right? It's a wet into wet technique. You work with the different colors kind of bleeding into one another as one kind of blended shape. Now, something else I want to show you a little bit about is the place down here at the bottom. One thing I noticed about the image is that the shadow from the flower is much more kind of soft, right? Doesn't have a hard edge shadow around it, but it's kind of a soft, kind of darker place. The way you can do that, wash my brush out really well. And normally I would let this dry first, but what I'm gonna do is, for the sake of time here, I'm gonna, actually, now that I think about it, I'm gonna switch to my flat brush. So I'm gonna use this flat brush. And so I'm gonna take my water, and it would be a good idea to have clean water at this point. And what I'm gonna do is to actually paint the paper just with water. I'm gonna avoid what I just painted there because I don't really want that to bleed into that. But I'm gonna paint that area with just water. And then I'm gonna go back to my shadow. This time I don't necessarily want that yellow in there. I'm gonna pick up my blue and my brown, because that one is a little more kind of a straightforward, kind of cool bluish shadow. And then to create that shadow of that flower, it is, like I mentioned, much more kind of a soft shape. Looks like my water has pretty much almost dried because my edges are pretty hard, right? So I dilly-dallied too much. I'm gonna go back with my big brush because it's got water in it. And I'm just gonna soften the edge of that flower shape. And really normally what would happen, right, if I worked a little more quickly, is that the water in the rest of that section would kind of, suck up the edges of the shapes that you're painting and just help them, bleed out a little bit, right, to be pretty soft, kind of diffused shadow forms. So because that shadow is kind of right on the edge of my composition, Unfortunately, I'm not able to show you much of it, but this is the idea of a really soft shadow, right? As opposed to one that has a little more of a distinct edge to it. The last thing I want to show you in this is that if I'm looking at, I'm going to point back at my picture here. If I'm looking at the shadows on the vase itself, the color of the vase here is so drastically different from the color of the vase on the top where the light's hitting it. I want to get pretty close to what is happening there. It might take me a couple of layers, but what I'll show you now is how to go about mixing something like that. Okay, so I've got my yellow in place already, but I want to be able to mix this to create that shadow on the vase itself. So go back. Got my first layer of yellow there. I'm going to pick up a good amount of that yellow. I'm going to pick up my burnt umber. I'm going to use a good amount of that burnt umber. But I also want to get some of my ultramarine blue. All right, so the brown in the mix is going to keep it from turning green. And so if I have a color, something like this, which is really yellow as its base, but it uses my dark brown as well as my cool ultramarine blue, right, to cool it down and to make it look like a shadow. Okay, so I think we're pretty close to what I'm looking at. I don't want it to be too watery because it's pretty heavy, it's pretty dark. So let's go in with, I need my picture again. Got to avoid the very top of the vase, which is catching the light. And I'm probably actually using a brush that's just a little bit bigger than I should be. And then the dark shadow of that color starts to wrap around the base and do something like this. I didn't wet this vase before I did this because I don't want to kind of, get what's on there wet already because I'm got that yellow in place that I don't really want to mess up. So instead, I'm going back with a brush that's got just a little bit of water in it. And I'm moving it along the edge of that dark value that I just painted. And I'm just kind of softening that up. Running that blotted brush along the edge of my shadow. And if I were really wanting to finish this, I would wrap that shadow color all the way around to the right side of it. But let me come back up to the top of the vase because I've got that same dark shadow on the inside of it, right? There is that green stem that pops out from the top there too. But for now, let me go ahead and kind of shape that just a little bit. I leave room for the green stem. And if I notice that as it's drying, I need to soften the edges a little more, certainly don't hesitate to do that, but also don't feel like you're painting, right? The shadow colors that you're using have to necessarily always look super photographic, right? After all, this is watercolor, and we're not really trying to create a photographic effect with what we're doing. We're really trying to do a watercolor interpretation, right, of the things that we're looking at. And then as it goes over to the right, it does get quite a bit weaker. So what I'm going to do is again blot my brush on the paper towel and then pull my brush toward that shadow color to, again, just kind of soften that out, diffuse it. So hopefully this kind of demystifies the process of making